sisi wenyewe tunaumia. Ile kitu ambayo tunategemea.
We are suffering. We rely on livestock, but you can now see how the cows are dying and some are unable to stay on their feet. We are unable to take care of our children.
Vitu ambayo tunampatia watoto.
On day 2 of the UN Climate Summit in Egypt, much of the talk revolved around the Climate Fund. But the UN warned last week that the global effort to cut emissions is woefully inadequate.
We, the Uru people, have been left with nothing. Like our ancestors, we trusted the lake and relied on it. We believed that it would stay forever, but it didn't. The lake, the source of our livelihood, dried up all of a sudden.
I can tell you today that the United Kingdom is delivering on our commitment of £11.6 billion. And as part of this, we will now triple our funding on adaptation to £1.5 billion by 2025.
Je veux ici être très clair, la France sera au rendez-vous de ses engagements et fidèle à ce que j'ai déjà dit. C'est pourquoi la France soutient l'interdiction de toute exploitation des grands fonds marins. J'assume cette position et la porterai dans les enceintes internationales.
C'est ce qu'on appelle des phénomènes de mortalité inhabituels. En général, ce sont des causes liées à l'environnement.
This is called the unusual mortality phenomenon. In general, the excess deaths are linked to the environment. It could be due to the toxic substances or pollutants.
Prédisposer les échouages.
Donc en ce moment, on a des groupes politiques et des
political groups and governments are meeting for COP27. They are going to discuss a lot of things, but for naturalists like me, animal suffering is the most important issue. Global warming is not just an empty word. It is hurting marine mammals. They are hungry and looking for something to eat. Instead, they find themselves dead on our beaches. Perhaps one day we humans will also meet the same fate.
Des mammifères marins qui ont faim, qui cherchent à manger et qui se retrouvent morts sur nos plages.
We have felt the difference here, because of the pollution. My son has had the breathing issue yesterday, and he felt very uncomfortable.
The two largest economies, the United States and China, have a particular responsibility to join efforts to make this pact a reality. And this is our only hope of meeting our climate goals. Humanity has a choice: cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
A climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact? That was the question asked by the United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres. But is anyone listening? Why are rich countries not doing enough to save the planet? Will they ever pay any sort of climate compensation to poorer nations? Will the 27th session of the Climate Summit result in countries taking meaningful action? Let's see what happened 8 years ago. World leaders had assembled in Paris for the 21st edition of the United Nations Climate Change Conference. On the 12th of December 2015, 196 countries adopted a legally binding international treaty on climate change, better known as the Paris Agreement.
J'invite maintenant la COP à adopter le projet de décision intitulé Accord de Paris qui figure dans le document. Je regarde la salle, je vois que la réaction est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
There was cheer, joy, and hope. The historic agreement was signed to limit global warming below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. The agreement also aimed at reaching global net zero emissions, or being carbon neutral. This means the amount of greenhouse gases emitted should be equal to the amount removed from the atmosphere in the second half of the century. But have these goals been achieved?
Unfortunately, my real expectations going there are very low because we see very limited progress. We have a geopolitically very challenging situation in the world with the Ukraine war, with the economy moving into recession, inflation levels rising, trust levels being at a very low level. And as we know, climate action requires trust and collaboration among all countries in the world. So I'm really worried coming to COP27.
The United Nations Climate Change Conference began in Berlin in 1995. The Conference of Parties is the apex decision-making body of the convention.
You're gonna wake up. It's a crise climatique and nobody's waking up.
Over the years, these summits have been disrupted by many climate protesters who accuse governments of doing little for the planet. They have been highlighting their fears about the effects of global warming and demanding more aid for poor countries hit by extreme weather conditions. This year, too, is no different.
Today, the multilateral development banks are giving an update on their Paris alignment. And we don't think that Paris alignment should include funding to fossil fuels, and all of the multilateral development banks, apart from the EIB, don't have an exclusion for fossil fuels in place, so they're still funding coal, oil and gas projects across the world.
Fossil free! What do we want? Public finance! How do we want it? Fossil free! What do we want? Public finance!
I was so happy when they announced that COP will be in Africa, and I thought maybe we'll get a chance to be at the room where the negotiations are taking place. But today I can tell you I wasn't allowed to access the room, and so I'm like, why are we here? So my worry is, even in Africa today, the COP is in Africa, but we have not been given a chance to speak.
The Earth's average temperature has already increased approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. According to a 2021 assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the world will reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within the next 2 decades, even if nations drastically cut emissions immediately. We can already see the dire consequences of extreme weather conditions. During their opening speeches at the COP27 climate summit, world leaders and diplomats framed the fight against global warming as a battle for human survival. The head of the United Nations famously declared the world was speeding down a highway to hell.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Let's see which are the main countries responsible for climate change. Equally importantly, who should be held accountable when climate change harms the world's poorest countries. This is the world's most populated country, the People's Republic of China. China is the world's largest manufacturer in terms of output and has gained a reputation as the world's factory. It's also the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter and also the largest consumer of coal. In fact, China consumes more than half the world's coal, burning 3 billion tons in 2020 alone. It is currently building over half of the world's new coal-based power plants. Unfortunately, China's carbon emissions threaten global efforts to fight climate change. Experts believe it will be among the countries hardest hit by global warming. This year, it recorded its hottest summer. China's longest river, Yangtze, dried up, sparking a shortage of hydropower.
China has been actively responding to climate change with sustained and pragmatic actions.
The country sent a delegation group of more than 50 people to COP27. Top climate envoy Xi Jinping said his country would not retreat from the fight against global warming. China is the world's second biggest economy, and its status as a developing country has become a contentious issue. But the Xi Jinping government insists that it cannot be put in the same category as developed countries, as it still has to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. Despite leading some of the most important initiatives to combat climate change, the United States is the second highest emitter of greenhouse gases after China. Over the course of history, it has cumulatively produced more CO2 than any other nation. Even today, Americans have carbon footprints that are roughly 3 times the global average. Let's look at this example. Global food loss and waste generate annually about 8% of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. According to the non-profit organization Feeding America, the United States discards more food than any other country in the world, nearly 40 million tons every year. That's estimated to be 30 to 40% of the entire US food supply. You heard that right. A third of all food in the US gets wasted. Fixing that could help fight climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions from the 27 member states of the European Union and the UK comprise about 8% of the global total. In December 2020, the EU adopted ambitious new targets to curb climate change. The bloc enshrined in law targets to cut net emissions by at least 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels and reduce them to zero by 2050. But this was before Russia invaded Ukraine. According to a report by the International Energy Agency, the world is facing its first truly global energy crisis. The war can derail Europe's green future.
War is definitely a backslide. It's a slowdown and threatens our ability to reach the climate goals, not only because of the short-term policies that tends to compensate consumption of diesel, gasoline and electricity, but also because of this general distrust in the world and this tendency of having a crisis where all focus is set. All focus is now set on investing in military defense, on dealing with the geopolitical problems related to NATO, related to Russia, to Ukraine.
Last year at COP26, India, along with Britain, introduced the One Sun, One World and One Grid formula. It aims to build a global green energy grid, primarily focusing on solar and wind energy.
भारत 2030 तक अपनी नॉन फोसिल एनर्जी कैपेसिटी को 500 गीगावाट तक पहुंचाएगा। दूसरा, भारत 2030 तक अपनी 50% एनर्जी रिक्वायरमेंट्स रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी से पूरी करेगा। तीसरा, भारत अब से लेकर 2030 तक के कुल प्रोजेक्टेड कार्बन एमिशन में 1 बिलियन टन की कमी करेगा। चौथा, 2030 तक भारत अपनी अर्थव्यवस्था की कार्बन इंटेंसिटी को 45% से भी कम करेगा। और पांचवा, वर्ष 2070 तक भारत नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य हासिल करेगा।
Even at COP27, the Indian Minister for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Bhupender Yadav, said that India is committed to clean and green energy. But can India lead the world by example? So far, rich countries have resisted the notion of compensation for their part in emitting greenhouse emissions, responsible for the losses and damages vulnerable countries suffered. But will it change this year? It is certainly one of the agendas of the ongoing climate change conference. Developing countries have been demanding for a special loss and damage fund to combat climate change for quite a few years now.
Africa contributes less than 3% of the pollution responsible for climate change.
This year, too, leaders of countries flooded or parched due to climate change are pleading for an urgent financial lifeline from richer nations. Let's understand what is loss and damage funding. It refers to costs already being incurred from climate-fueled weather extremes or impacts, like rising sea levels. Climate funding so far has focused on cutting carbon dioxide emissions to curb climate change, while about a third of it has gone towards projects to help communities adapt to future impacts. Loss and damage funding would be different. It goes directly to compensating costs that countries can't avoid or adapt to.
Many developing countries right now, in order to service their debt, are facing real challenges. In fact, UNDP published a paper just a few weeks ago in which we estimate that 54 countries are now facing potentially debt distress. That's essentially a step away from not being able to pay the interest or even to pay your debts. And that is a very serious situation.
Who pays and who gets paid? The United States and European Union have resisted the argument for years, fearing spiraling liabilities. At COP27, when US climate envoy John Kerry said that America will provide $11.4 billion per year by 2024 to help developing countries green their economies, this happened.
Your accelerator is you're working with polluters.
How specifically will you?
You're not going to do false solutions. You're promoting false solutions. John Kerry, you're promoting false solutions.
This is what I was talking about.
Clearly, there is a lack of trust. Will a fund be created, and who will participate in it? Only a few governments have made small, symbolic funding commitments to help poorer countries. These include Denmark, Scotland, Austria, Belgium, Ireland, and Germany. On the other hand, drought-stricken countries led by Senegal and Spain announced an alliance to help each other manage water scarcity by sharing technology and expertise.
Let's open the door to the low-carbon age.
In 2009, wealthy nations pledged to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance annually by 2020 to help vulnerable nations deal with climate change. Over the years, they have failed to raise the funding they had promised. The $100 billion commitments were reiterated in other climate summits too. Last year, ahead of COP26, they devised a climate finance delivery plan. It concluded that the $100 billion target would be met, but not until 2023. Can they be trusted? Meanwhile, climate change continues to wreak havoc globally. Higher average temperatures, melting ice, longer-lasting droughts, more intense wildfires, 1 million species at risk of extinction. The world is running out of time.